Hello, I'm Keith Hocton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. The year is 1553, and the crown of England has fallen to Mary Tudor, the daughter of King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She would rule for just 5 years, yet nearly 5 centuries later, most people actually only know her by her nickname rather than her name, Bloody Mary. It's one of the most famous and enduring labels in English history. Mention it today, and most people immediately think of burning Protestants at the stake, religious fanaticism, a queen who was determined to drag England back into the Catholic fold. Yet history, I think, is rarely that simple. Was Mary truly the monster that Protestant writers later portrayed? Or was she something far more complicated, a woman shaped by personal tragedy, political turmoil, and an unshakable faith that convinced her she was saving souls rather than destroying them? Today, I'd like to cut through the myth and the propaganda to explore the woman behind the nickname. I'd like to look at her extraordinary childhood, her turbulent reign, her marriage, her religion, and the England that she inherited. An England already fractured by decades of upheaval and religious revolution. However, before I begin, I think it's worth clearing up one of the most common points of confusion in British history. Not long ago, I was having a conversation with a friend and I mentioned Bloody Mary, and she immediately asked, "Do you mean Mary, Queen of Scots?" And look, it's an understandable mistake. Both women were called Mary. Both were Catholic queens living in an age when religion could actually determine whether you lived or died. Both found themselves surrounded by conspiracies and political intrigue, imprisonment, and of course, deep fear. And both would become tragic figures whose lives ended in disappointment and sorrow. Yet beyond those similarities, they were entirely different women, trapped inside entirely different stories. Mary Tudor was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. She was English to the core, born into the heart of the Tudor court. And from an early age, she learned how brutal power could be. As a child, she was treated as a princess destined for greatness. But all of that changed when Henry became determined to end his marriage to Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn instead. The consequences were absolutely devastating. Mary's mother was cast aside, her parents' marriage was declared invalid, and the young princess suddenly found herself stripped of status and declared illegitimate. The daughter, who had once stood near the center of power, became a political embarrassment, isolated from her mother and pressured to accept a reality that she knew to be false. Those experiences would have left very deep scars. By the time Mary finally became queen in 1553, England had already been transformed by the religious changes begun under her father and accelerated under her half-brother, Edward VI. Monasteries had vanished, ancient traditions had been swept away, and Protestants were gaining ground across the kingdom. Mary viewed these developments not simply as political changes, but actually as a profound spiritual crisis. She believed with absolute sincerity that England had abandoned the true faith and that millions of souls were actually in danger. Her determination to reverse those changes would define her reign and ultimately shape her reputation for centuries to come. To her critics, she became a cruel and fanatical tyrant. To her supporters, she was a courageous queen trying to save her kingdom from what she saw as religious error and, I suppose, also eternal damnation. What makes Mary such a fascinating figure to me is that she wasn't motivated by cynicism or ambition. She actually genuinely believed that she was doing the right thing. And there's something deeply tragic about that because she was actually fighting a battle against forces that were already larger than herself. And in many ways, Mary Tudor spent her reign attempting to reverse history, and history is rarely, I have to say, ever willing to move backwards. Mary, Queen of Scots, by contrast, lived a very different life. Although she possessed Tudor blood and a very strong claim to the English throne, she was Scottish and not English, and spent much of her youth in the glittering French court. Her world was one of music, of poetry, of dancing, and I would also guess aristocratic sophistication. She became Queen of Scotland while still an infant, and briefly Queen of France as a young woman. Yet when she returned to Scotland, she found herself ruling a kingdom that was completely divided by religion and poisoned by political rivalry. I think what followed was one of the great dramas of European history. Her reign became entangled in disastrous marriages, in scandal, in rebellion, murder, and of course, endless accusations. Noblemen plotted against her. Factions battled for control of the kingdom, and of course, rumors swirled around her involvement in the death of her own husband. Eventually, she fled south, hoping that her cousin, Elizabeth I, would offer protection and support. Instead, she found herself imprisoned for 19 years before Elizabeth finally signed the warrant that sent her to the executioner's block. Mary, Queen of Scots, has always possessed a certain romantic quality. She appears in history almost like a tragic heroine, glamorous, impulsive, and doomed from the very beginning. Mary Tudor, to me, feels very different. Hers is a darker and more intimate story because it centers on a woman who spent her entire life enduring rejection, humiliation, and disappointment before finally gaining the power that she believed would allow her to put everything right. The tragedy, I think, is that by the time she achieved that power, England had already begun moving in a direction that she could never fully control. And this is where our story begins. The more I read about Mary Tudor, the more I wondered whether the nickname Bloody Mary is entirely fair. There is no question that her reign saw terrible religious persecution and that hundreds died at the stake. Yet, when you place her alongside other Tudor monarchs, the picture becomes more complicated. Henry VIII executed thousands during his reign. Under Edward VI, thousands more died, suppressing, rebellions against religious change. Tudor England wasn't a gentle age, and mercy was rarely regarded as a political virtue. Yet, interestingly, it's Mary alone who carries the nickname. There's a very strong argument that her achievements are often overlooked, and I agree with this. She was England's first crowned queen regent, first woman to rule the kingdom in her own right. She fought successfully to secure her throne against rivals. She actually stabilized the royal finances. She established important precedents for how a queen could marry and still exercise sovereign authority. She even strengthened the navy, something that always earns a few points in my book. History, however, I don't think it's been especially kind to her. And part of that may simply be because she lost. Protestant England survived her and eventually flourished under Elizabeth I. The winners wrote the history books where Mary became the villain of the story. And I think there's also another element at work. Historians have long debated whether the image of Bloody Mary says as much about attitudes towards female rulers as it does about Mary herself. Male rulers who presided over slaughter on a far greater scale often escaped with their reputations largely intact. Mary, meanwhile, became defined almost entirely by those 5 years of religious persecution. Whatever the truth, it's impossible to understand Mary the Queen without first understanding Mary the child. So I'll take you back to that time. She was born on the 18th of February, 1516, at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, the only surviving child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. There was celebration across the kingdom, although perhaps not quite as much as there would have been had Mary been a boy, because England wanted a male heir. Henry wanted a male heir, but the king was nevertheless delighted by a healthy daughter. As a child, Mary received one of the finest educations in Europe. Her mother was herself highly educated and the daughter of the very formidable Isabella of Castile, and she ensured that her daughter enjoyed the same advantages. Mary learned languages. She would have also learned music, theology, and the classical subjects expected of a Renaissance princess. Indeed, for much of her early life, she was treated very much like an heir to the throne. Henry absolutely adored her. Visitors to court were frequently summoned to admire her accomplishments. The king delighted in showing off his intelligent daughter, praising her language skills, her musical ability, and her remarkable maturity. And I think for a time, Mary seemed destined for a very glittering future. Diplomatic marriages were discussed at an early age with the great royal houses of Europe, and she absolutely occupied a central place in Tudor politics. Then everything changed. As Catherine grew older and the prospect of producing a son faded, Henry became increasingly desperate for a male heir. And when Anne Boleyn entered his life, the foundations of Mary's world began to crumble. What followed wouldn't only destroy her mother's marriage, but shape Mary's character for the rest of her life. I think it's also very easy for us to assume that Mary's position as Henry's heir was always fragile because she was a girl. Yet the reality, I think, was much more complicated. England had never successfully crowned a queen regent, a queen ruling in her own right, rather than as the wife of a king. There had been, the bitter struggle over Matilda in the 12th century, but she never managed to secure the crown. And the idea of a woman ruling England, well, that remained untested territory. Yet elsewhere in Europe, powerful queens were hardly unknown. Mary's own grandmother, Isabella of Castile, one of the most formidable rulers to have ever ruled in the entire history of Europe. She united Spain, she sponsored Columbus, she helped shape the future of Europe. Her daughter, Joanna of Castile, inherited a kingdom in her own right. Catherine of Aragon never doubted that women could rule, and that example set well within her own family. As for Henry VIII, he appears to have been genuinely torn. He desperately wanted a son, but for many years, Mary remained his only surviving legitimate child. She was educated like a prince, treated as the heir apparent in all but name, and even sent to Wales in much the same way that her elder brother Arthur had before he died. Diplomatic marriages were discussed with the greatest royal houses in Europe, and I think there was every indication that Henry was preparing her for the possibility that she might one day inherit the throne. There was, however, another possibility. Henry had an illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, whom he openly acknowledged and showered with honors, and some wondered whether Fitzroy might eventually become Henry's chosen successor. Yet even that uncertainty remained manageable while Mary was still the king's beloved daughter. And then Anne Boleyn appeared. She was young, she was intelligent, she was certainly ambitious, and she was utterly captivating. Anne represented something new. To Henry, she symbolized not only romance, but possibility. Most importantly of all, I think, she offered hope for the son that Henry so desperately wanted. And once Anne became pregnant, everything changed with astonishing speed. The old world vanished overnight. Anne was crowned queen in 1533, and when her child was born in September of that year, England must have held its breath. Henry was expecting a prince. Instead, the child was a girl, Elizabeth. For Mary, the consequences were devastating. The princess, who had stood at the center of Tudor politics, was suddenly pushed aside. No longer was she addressed as Princess Mary, she became simply the Lady Mary. Henry now insisted that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had never been valid, and if that marriage was invalid, then Mary herself was illegitimate. This was more than a legal technicality. It was a destruction of her identity. Her household was reduced, her status disappeared. Worse still, she was sent to serve in the household of the infant Elizabeth, a humiliating reminder that another child had replaced her in her father's affections and, more importantly, in the line of succession. Yet one of the most remarkable things about Mary is that she never ever blamed Elizabeth herself. Throughout her life, she showed genuine affection towards her younger half-sister, just as she later showed affection towards her half-brother Edward. The bitterness was directed not at the children, but at the adults who had actually engineered the situation. And meanwhile, Henry was slowly tightening the screws. He separated Mary from her mother and refused repeated requests for them to see one another. Catherine, increasingly ill and isolated, begged to be allowed access to her daughter. Henry refused. He was determined to force both women into submission. What he wanted was simple. He wanted Mary to acknowledge him as supreme head of the Church of England. He wanted his daughter to accept that his marriage to Catherine had been invalid, and he wanted her to admit that she herself was illegitimate. To her credit, she wouldn't yield. And the result was heartbreaking. In January 1536, Catherine of Aragon died without seeing her daughter ever again. When news reached Mary, she was absolutely devastated. The woman who had been her greatest source of strength and guidance was now gone. Yet even then, Mary refused to bend completely. When Anne Boleyn herself fell from favor and was executed later that very same year, Mary briefly allowed herself to hope that everything might be restored. Surely now her father would welcome her back into favor. Instead, Henry doubled down. Anne was gone, and he still expected Mary to submit. The demands remained exactly the same. A reconciliation would eventually come, but only after years of pressure, isolation, and emotional warfare. Henry was determined to break his daughter's resistance, and Mary, well, she was every bit as stubborn as her father. Once Mary finally submitted to her father, her life became considerably easier. Henry always rewarded obedience generally. Fine clothes returned to Mary. Comfortable residences were then provided. She spent time at Hampton Court and was welcomed back into court life. The years of open confrontation gradually faded, and Mary settled into a careful existence built on diplomacy, patience, and of course survival. She had learned a lesson that would serve her throughout her life, that sometimes it was better to bend than to break. One of the most surprising aspects of these years is how close she became to her younger half-brother Edward, the son Henry had wanted for so long. And despite an age gap of nearly 20 years, Mary developed genuine affection for him. She would visit him regularly, she spent time with him at court, and she took an active interest in his upbringing. The relationship, of course, wasn't without tension. Edward was still growing into a committed Protestant, while Mary remained a devoted Catholic. Yet family ties still mattered importantly to her, and she showed the same warmth towards Edward that she would later show towards Elizabeth. Marriage, however, remained a problem. As a child, Mary had been one of the most desirable brides in Europe. Royal houses competed for the possibility of an alliance with England. But once Henry declared her illegitimate, much of that value disappeared overnight. More importantly, Henry no longer trusted her. He knew that she remained sympathetic to Catholic Europe, and he feared that a marriage into one of the great Habsburg dynasties might create a rival power centering around his daughter. As a result, Mary remained unmarried, carefully watched, and permanently under the eye of the court. Yet, even without doing anything, Mary remained dangerous. Her very existence was a threat. It's one of those strange realities of monarchy that sometimes a person's greatest power comes simply from being alive. Mary, Queen of Scots, would later find herself in exactly the same position. She didn't need to raise an army or plot rebellion. Her bloodline alone made her a danger to those who held power. Mary Tudor occupied a very similar position. Every year that passed without additional male heirs increased her importance. Henry's dream had always been a secure male succession. There's no secret about that. Instead, as he aged and his health deteriorated, it became increasingly obvious that the Tudor future rested upon a single fragile boy. When Henry died in 1547, that boy became King Edward VI. Edward was only 9 years old, but he inherited a kingdom that his father had already transformed radically. Under the governments that ruled in his name, England moved rapidly in Protestant direction. Churches changed, services changed, ancient Catholic practices disappeared. For Mary, I can only think that it would have been a painful development. And yet, at the same time, she navigated the years remarkably carefully. Although Edward strongly disapproved of her private Catholic worship, he generally tolerated her as long as she avoided open confrontation. As Edward grew older, though, another problem emerged. He was dying. By his mid-teens, it was becoming increasingly clear to all that surrounded him that the young king was gravely ill. The question that haunted the government was very obvious. What would happen when he died? According to Henry VIII's will, the succession was very straightforward. First came Edward and any sons that he might have. After Edward came Mary. After Mary came Elizabeth. Henry had arranged it that way largely to prevent the Scottish branch of the family, Mary Queen of Scots, from inheriting the throne through the descendants of his eldest sister, Margaret Tudor. The trouble was, Mary was Catholic. To the leading Protestants around Edward, the prospect of Mary becoming queen threatened everything they had spent years building. If she inherited the throne, England might be dragged back towards Rome. The Protestant Reformation could be undone in a matter of months. The most powerful man at court was a man by the name of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, and he decided to prevent that from happening. As Edward lay dying, plans were put in motion to alter the succession. Mary would be bypassed, so would Elizabeth. Instead, the crown would pass to the king's young cousin, Lady Jane Grey, a deeply Protestant teenager who had recently just married into the Dudley family. It was an extraordinary gamble, and it was about to plunge England into one of the most dramatic succession crises in history. When Edward VI finally lay dying in the summer of 1553, everyone understood what was at stake. The young king himself was only 15 years old, but the Protestant Reformation in England rested squarely upon his shoulders. If Mary inherited the throne, as Henry VIII's will required, there was every possibility that the religious changes of the previous 2 decades would be reversed, and reversed quickly. For the leading Protestants around Edward, well, that was an unacceptable prospect. Mary and Elizabeth were excluded from the succession, and the crown was instead offered to the king's young cousin, Lady Jane Grey. Jane herself was only 15 years old, and she didn't seek the throne. By most accounts, she was horrified when she was told that she was to become queen. Yet, in the ruthless world of Tudor politics, personal wishes counted for very little. On the 6th of July, 1553, Edward died. The news was initially concealed while the machinery of the coup was put into motion. 4 days later, Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen of England. So, on paper, Mary had no chance whatsoever. Jane's supporters controlled London. They controlled the treasury, the government, the royal seals, and, of course, the Tower of London itself. They possessed the administrative machinery of the kingdom, and, of course, they had access to its military resources. And Mary actually possessed none of those things. What she did possess was legitimacy, and as it turned out, the love of the people. Fortunately for Mary, she realized the danger almost immediately. Summoned towards London, she sensed a trap, and she fled before her enemies could seize her. Riding hard into East Anglia, she reached the estates left to her by her father, and then immediately began gathering support. And it was a desperate gamble, and even her allies thought she was doomed. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Altadomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Altadomus, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. The Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe and Mary's closest international supporter, effectively advised caution. The odds were simply overwhelming. How could one woman with a handful of followers possibly challenge a government that controlled the kingdom? And yet, something extraordinary happened. As news spread across England, support for Mary surged. Men flocked to her banner. Local gentry declared for her cause. Towns actually proclaimed her the rightful queen. The further events unfolded, the clearer it became that Jane Grey might possess the institutions of government, but Mary actually possessed something far more powerful. She possessed public support. Meanwhile, panic spread among her opponents. Northumberland marched out of London to arrest her, but every mile he travelled seemed to weaken his own position. Those who had enthusiastically supported Lady Jane Grey suddenly began reconsidering their loyalties. The political tide turned with astonishing speed. The moment Northumberland left London, the entire enterprise began to collapse. One by one, supporters abandoned the cause. Councillors switched sides. Noblemen changed their allegiance. The government that had seemed all-powerful only days earlier began to disintegrate before everyone's eyes. Then came the inevitable conclusion. Mary Tudor was proclaimed Queen of England. The crowds in London erupted with joy. Church bells rang across the kingdom. Bonfires blazed throughout the night. Amazingly, against every expectation, the daughter who had spent much of her life humiliated, disinherited, and pushed aside had seized the throne. And remarkably, she had done so with very little bloodshed. It remains one of the most astonishing political victories in English history. Mary is rarely described as a warrior queen. In fact, I've never heard her described that way. Yet, that's exactly what she was. She faced overwhelming odds, rallied support, outmaneuvered her opponents, and she won a kingdom that had already been taken from her once before. Lady Jane Grey was immediately imprisoned in the Tower. Northumberland was arrested and later executed. And yet, to her credit, Mary's first instinct wasn't revenge, quite the opposite. Many of her advisors urged her to execute Jane Grey immediately. The Holy Roman Emperor certainly thought it would be wise. After all, Jane had been proclaimed queen and had won the crown. In Tudor politics, that was more than enough to justify her death sentence. And yet Mary refused. She recognized what many others didn't. Jane Grey had been less a conspirator than a pawn, a teenager swept into a struggle engineered by very ambitious men. So Mary chose mercy. for the moment. As she entered London in triumph on the 3rd of August 1553, with her half-sister Elizabeth riding beside her, England greeted her with genuine enthusiasm. She was popular, she was legitimate, and she had overcome impossible odds. And for a brief moment, Mary Tudor stood at the height of her popularity. The tragedy is that the decision she made next would change everything. Mary had actually achieved what few people thought possible. She had seized the throne against overwhelming odds. She entered London in triumph and enjoyed a level of popularity that would surprise many modern listeners. So for a brief moment, England seemed united behind its new queen. Then came the question that every queen regent eventually faced: marriage. The problem, I think, was far more complicated for a female ruler than it was for a king. If Mary married an English nobleman, every other noble family in the kingdom would immediately feel slighted. One faction would rise while the others would resent it. Yet if she married a foreign prince, there was an equally dangerous possibility. Would England then end up being governed by foreigners? Would a husband become king in all but name? It was a political minefield. Mary herself seems to have preferred the idea of remaining unmarried, but she also understood the brutal reality of monarchy. She was 37 years old. The Tudor dynasty remained fragile, and if she failed to produce an heir, the succession would pass to her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth. In Mary's eyes, marriage wasn't simply desirable, it was actually essential. So the man she chose was Philip of Spain, son of the Holy Roman Emperor, and heir to the most powerful Catholic empire in Europe. From Mary's perspective, the match made perfect sense. Philip was Catholic, he was politically powerful, and he was also capable of helping secure England's place within a wider Catholic alliance. To most Englishmen, however, it looked like a disaster. Rumors then began to spread that England would become little more than a Spanish province. People imagined Spanish advisors flooding into government and foreign interests dominating English affairs. Look, whether those fears were justified mattered less than the fact that they actually existed. And of course, opposition then gathered quickly. In early 1554, a rebellion bubbled and then erupted under the leadership of Sir Thomas Wyatt. The uprising was supposedly aimed at preventing the Spanish marriage, but it soon attracted a wider, I suppose, collection of malcontents, including supporters of the imprisoned Lady Jane Grey. Even Jane's own father joined the revolt. A remarkably foolish decision, given that his daughter actually remained very much at Mary's mercy in the Tower of London. For the first time since taking the throne, Mary's crown was genuinely under threat. And what happened next revealed a side of her character that is actually often overlooked. And I think she proved extraordinarily brave. Rather than hide behind palace walls, Mary rode into London and addressed her subjects directly. Standing at Guildhall, she delivered one of the great speeches of Tudor history. She presented herself not as a distant monarch, but as a mother defending her children. She reminded Londoners that she was their rightful queen, and she appealed directly to their loyalty. It worked. That speech electrified the city. When Wyatt finally approached London, the supporters that he had expected simply failed to materialize. The rebellion immediately collapsed. Wyatt was captured, his followers dispersed, and Mary's authority emerged even stronger than it was before. Yet victory always comes with a fantastic price tag. Up until this point, Mary had shown remarkable mercy. She'd spared Lady Jane Grey, despite the fact that Jane had briefly worn the crown. She had resisted calls for execution, and she seemed to recognize that the young girl had been little more than a pawn in other people's games. Now everything changed. The involvement of Jane's father convinced Mary and her advisors that Jane would always remain a focus for rebellion. As long as she lived, others would continue to rally around her claim. And reluctantly, after considerable hesitation, Mary signed her death warrant. Lady Jane Grey was executed in February 1554. It's often presented as one of the great crimes of Mary's reign, and I don't think it is, because context matters. Her grandfather, Henry VII, her father, Henry VIII, and virtually every European ruler of the age would almost certainly have acted far more quickly. In fact, Mary's hesitation probably tells us more about her character than the execution itself. Her instinct, her first instinct, had been mercy. It was politics that had actually forced her hand. The rebellion, of course, had other consequences. Suspicion also fell upon Elizabeth. Wyatt claimed that Elizabeth had some knowledge of the conspiracy, although whether that's true, it still remains very doubtful. Mary ordered her half-sister questioned and kept under close supervision. In another reign, Elizabeth might well have found herself on the scaffold. Instead, Mary confined her to house arrest and to surveillance. By Tudor standards, that's a surprisingly restrained response. With the rebellion crushed and Philip now her husband, Mary finally turned to the issue that had mattered most to her entire life: religion. For years, she had watched England drift away from the Catholic faith that she so cherished. Now, as queen, she intended to reverse that process. The trouble was that changing a nation's religion is far easier on paper than it actually is in reality. For the first year of Mary's reign, many English people remained cautiously optimistic. Modern history often gives the impression that England had become overwhelmingly Protestant by 1553, and that Mary's attempts to restore Catholicism were universally hated. I think the reality was rather more complicated. In many parts of the countryside, traditional Catholic practices had never entirely disappeared. Henry VIII had broken with Rome, yes, but he had remained surprisingly conservative in matters of doctrine, and the ordinary people still felt a strong attachment to the old religion. Mary, therefore, didn't see herself as launching a revolution. In her mind, what she was doing was restoring normalcy. The difficulty, I think, was that England had already changed. An entire generation had grown up under religious uncertainty. Some people welcomed the return of Catholic ceremonies. Others regarded Protestantism as a sacred cause worth dying for. The kingdom was now divided in a way that would have almost been unimaginable during Henry VIII's time. And this is where Mary made the decision that would define her reputation forever. Beginning in 1555, Protestants who refused to recite their beliefs were condemned as heretics, and instead of executing them by beheading them, she decided to burn them at the stake. In total, around 280 men and women were executed during the persecutions. Some were humble artisans and laborers. Others were leading Protestant bishops and preachers. The flames consumed ordinary people and prominent figures alike. Even many of Mary's allies thought it was a mistake. The Holy Roman Emperor himself warned that the burnings were creating martyrs rather than eliminating dissent. Executions were one thing, but burning people alive was something else entirely. Mary, however, believed that she was acting out of duty. And I think that's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of her story. She wasn't motivated by cruelty for its own sake. She genuinely believed that Protestantism endangered immortal souls. And in her mind, these punishments weren't merely legal acts but spiritual ones. Her duty as a Catholic monarch was to protect the faith and preserve the unity of the United Kingdom. The problem was that the policy achieved precisely the opposite. The victims became heroes. The smoke from those execution sites drifted far beyond England's towns and villages. Protestant writers seized upon every case. And I think there was none more influential than John Foxe, whose book, titled The Book of Martyrs, actually transformed the burnings into some of the most powerful stories in English Protestant memory. Written in vivid emotional language, Foxe's accounts spread across the country and eventually across the English-speaking world. You know, for generations, many English households owned only two books, the Bible and Foxe's Book of Martyrs. And that fact alone tells us everything about the scale of its influence. The timing could hardly have been worse for Mary. Printing presses were multiplying, literacy among the population was expanding, and of course news traveled further and faster than ever before. Previous Tudor governments had killed thousands during rebellions, but many of those deaths occurred far from the centers of influence, and they were quickly forgotten. Mary's persecutions, unfortunately, unfolded in an age when stories could be printed, copied, distributed quickly, and of course remembered. And of course, in modern Tudor language, the burnings went viral. And once they entered popular memory, they never left. This creates one of the great historical puzzles. Henry VIII executed vastly more people than Mary ever did, thousands more than Mary ever did. Edward VI's government crushed rebellions with extraordinary brutality. Elizabeth I would also execute subjects for religious reasons, yet it's Mary alone who became Bloody Mary. And I think part of the answer lies in the power of storytelling. The Protestant martyrs had chroniclers, they had printers, they had audiences eager to hear these stories, and above all, they had Foxe. The result was that Mary's entire reign became defined by a policy that lasted only a portion of it. And yet, I think there's also another tragedy here. For while the burnings were taking place, Mary was consumed by a far more personal struggle. She desperately wanted a child, not simply because she longed to be a mother, although she almost certainly did, but because the future of everything that she had fought for depended upon it. A Catholic heir would secure the succession and preserve her religious settlement. Without one, the throne would eventually pass to Protestant Elizabeth. Mary believed she was pregnant twice, and twice England celebrated, and twice there was no child. Today, historians generally believe that these were phantom pregnancies, one of the most heartbreaking episodes, if you like, in Tudor history. As Mary's hopes rose and, of course, then fell, so too did the prospects of a Catholic future for England. Had she produced a healthy son, the history of Britain would have been transformed. England would almost certainly have remained a Catholic kingdom. Elizabeth would never have become queen, and the entire course of the English Reformation would have been altered. Instead, Mary's greatest dream slowly slipped away, and with it went the future that she had spent her entire life trying to build. There was, however, one enormous question hanging over Mary's marriage. What exactly was Philip of Spain supposed to be? Mary was Queen of England in her own right. Philip was heir to the greatest Catholic power in Europe that the world had ever seen. Their marriage effectively united two of the most powerful dynasties on earth. Yet England had never faced this situation before. What title should a husband receive when his wife was the sovereign? To call him merely Prince Philip seemed almost absurd. This wasn't some minor nobleman marrying into the royal family. Philip was heir to an empire that stretched across continents. And yet many Englishmen feared giving him too much authority. They worried that England would become subordinate to Spanish interests, or, worse still, disappear into a vast empire. The compromise, I think, was very carefully negotiated. Philip would be king, but only in a limited sense. He could share Mary's title, but England remained Mary's kingdom. The marriage contract went to extraordinary lengths to prevent foreign control. Philip couldn't simply inherit England if Mary died, nor could he treat the kingdom as a possession. The English political class was determined to ensure that their queen remained firmly in charge. And the reason why all this mattered so much was simple. Everything depended on a child. A son born to Mary and Philip would inherit an extraordinary legacy. He would unite the Tudor and Habsburg dynasties and become one of the most powerful rulers Europe had ever seen. A child would secure England's Catholic future and, of course, transform the balance of power across the continent. And Mary actually understood this better than anyone. She was 37 years old when she married Philip. Time would have been running incredibly short. Every hope she possessed, political, religious, and personal, rested upon producing an heir. It's difficult to not feel sympathy for Mary. Behind the crown and the politics stood a woman who desperately wanted to be a mother, who knew that every month without a child increased the likelihood that her half-sister Elizabeth would eventually inherit the throne. Meanwhile, Philip came and went from England. Initially, many of his Spanish attendants looked down on the English, dismissing them as uncultured and provincial. Yet, Philip himself surprisingly adapted. He took an interest in English affairs. He encouraged improvements to the navy and gradually became more comfortable in his adopted kingdom. The problem was never Philip himself. The problem was what Philip actually represented. England's traditional rival had always been France. And of course, by marrying Philip, Mary had aligned England firmly with the Habsburgs' world, and perhaps also against the French. Many of the fears expressed before the wedding now began to reappear. People worried that English interests would become secondary to Spanish interests, and that England would be dragged into wars that were never their own. Unfortunately, those fears proved justified. As Mary's reign progressed, she increasingly supported Philip's foreign policy. England entered the Habsburgs' conflict against France, and the consequences were disastrous. In 1558, the French captured Calais, England's last remaining possession on the European continent, and the loss of Calais was a profound shock. For more than 2 centuries, Calais had been England's foothold in France, a lingering reminder, if you like, of the great victories of the 100 Years' War. Of course, now it was gone. The timing could scarcely have been worse. Harvests failed, economic difficulties were mounting, and Mary's hopes of producing an heir, well, they were fading fast. Her popularity was also declining. News of the Calais loss felt like a final blow. One contemporary remarked that when Mary died, the word Calais would be found engraved upon her heart. You know, whether she actually said it hardly matters. The story survives because it captures what I think is the deeper truth. By the end of her reign, the Queen who had entered London to cheering crowds now found herself watching the future she had dreamed of slipping steadily beyond her reach. So the question begs, how should we judge Mary Tudor? The answer, I think, is that she was neither the monster of Protestant legend nor the saint of Catholic memory. She was something far more interesting, I think. She was a determined, intelligent, deeply religious woman who inherited a fractured kingdom that had been turned upside down by her father and then transformed again by her brother. Much of her reign was actually spent trying to reverse changes that many English people had already accepted. That struggle would ultimately defeat her. Yet to dismiss her as merely a failure is to miss just how remarkable her achievements were. When she married Philip of Spain, she helped establish principles that would echo through centuries of British history. The idea that a queen would remain sovereign in her own right, while her husband occupied a subordinate position, became a blueprint that later generations would follow. Without Mary, it becomes much harder to imagine Queen Anne or Queen Victoria or even Queen Elizabeth II exercising authority in the way that they did. She was also a political survivor of the highest order, so kudos to her. You know, twice she fought for her crown, first against Northumberland and the attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, and then against Wyatt's rebellion. On both occasions, she prevailed. The woman, often remembered as weak, proved remarkably resilient when her position was threatened. And I think Mary was far more of a warrior queen than she's been given credit for. Nor was her government entirely unsuccessful. She was the one who stabilized the royal finances. She strengthened the navy. She worked closely with her council. And I think she demonstrated that a woman could govern effectively in a world that overwhelmingly believed power belonged to men. And yet there remains the shadow that hangs over everything. The burnings. I almost feel like if she was in front of me, I would say to her, "What were you thinking?" So around 280 Protestants died during her reign. No amount of context, I think, can make those deaths disappear. Mary genuinely believed she was saving souls and genuinely protecting the unity of the kingdom. But good intentions don't lessen the horror of watching men and women being burned alive for their beliefs. The policy failed politically, hands down. It failed religiously and succeeded only in creating martyrs whose stories would outlive her by centuries. And I think partially that reflects the power of Protestant storytelling. And I think it partly also reflects the fact that the burnings were recorded, printed, and remembered. And perhaps, just perhaps, it also reflects the harsher judgment history has often reserved for women who exercise power. What's certain is that Mary deserves to be remembered as more than a nickname. When she died in November 1558, aged just 42, the Catholic future she had worked so hard to create died with her. The crown passed to Elizabeth, Protestantism returned, and the England Mary had dreamed of building vanished overnight. Yet her legacy endures. She proved that a woman could sit on England's throne. She commanded armies, she governed a kingdom, and she wielded royal authority every bit as fully as any king. So when she died in November 1558, aged only 42, the crown passed peacefully to her half-sister. Within months, England was moving back towards a Protestant rule. The Catholic restoration that had consumed Mary's reign began to unravel. The future that she had imagined simply vanished. Elizabeth would then rule for 45 years. Mary ruled for only 5. And that gave Elizabeth time to outlive her critics, to establish a legend and become the centerpiece of a national story. Mary never really had that luxury. She died before her project was complete, before success or failure could finally reveal itself. History tends to be kinder to winners. Yet, when we step back from the myths, Mary Tudor appears rather differently. She was England's first queen regent. That says something. History actually remembers her by a nickname, but I think perhaps it's time that we remembered her by her name, Mary Tudor. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.